Standing by.
Lock S-foils in attack position.
Designed by defectors, refined in hidden workshops, and flown by ordinary people who were fighting for a better future. Seeing over 30 years of service across 3 galactic navies, this family of multi-role snub fighters changed starfighter design forever. From T-65 to T-70 and up to T-85, these fighters were rugged, reliable, and could do everything that was asked of them, usually flying headfirst into overwhelming odds. This is the story of Incom's flagship product, the starfighter that changed the course of history at the battles of Yavin, Endor, and Exegol, and continues to serve today. This is the design and development of the X-Wing. Our story begins with 2 very different fighters back in the Clone Wars, the diminutive Z-95 and the gigantic ARC-170. The Z-95 family was a series of single-seat light starfighter designs, jointly manufactured by the Incom Corporation and Sublight Products. As designed, the Z-95 was simple to build, simple to fly, and had essentially none of the bells and whistles that we take for granted on contemporary starfighters. Armed with a pair of Taman-back KX-5 laser cannons, the Z-95 had no hyperdrive and no space for an astromech droid in the rear, with only limited supplies for the pilot. However, this cheap and cheerful design made it a perfect fit for the rapidly expanding Republic Navy, and clone Z-95s saw massive production numbers, garnering a reputation as a highly adaptable and durable fighter, with both dogfight and ground attack capability. This was in stark contrast to Incom and Subpro's other fighter program of the time, the monstrous ARC-170. This was designed as a heavy fighter, with ARC standing for Aggressive Reconnaissance. It was developed simultaneously with the much larger and less successful PTB-625 planetary bomber, and shared many design elements with that project. Unlike the Z-95, the ARC-170 had a crew of 3, with a pilot and co-pilot up front in a tandem cockpit, and a tail gunner protecting the rear. It also had space for an astromech droid who could operate the onboard Class 1.5 hyperdrive, allowing the ARCs to perform deep space missions and forward recon away from the main fleet. Remember though, it is aggressive reconnaissance. The ARC-170 had 2 comically massive HL-7 laser cannons mounted under each wing, with ventral and dorsal Tau-40 laser cannons for the rear gunner. To complement this, the starfighter also had twin proton torpedo launchers, with 6 torpedoes carried in a standard loadout. All in all, a pretty huge step up from the twin KX-5 armament of the Z-95. Another iconic feature of the ARC series were the S-foils on each wing. These folding outer wings massively increased the efficiency of the front-mounted deflector shield, but had the added benefit of providing cooling for the engines, which was necessary in high-octane combat conditions. The ARC-170 would replace the aging V-19 Torrent in frontline fighter roles within the Republic Navy from about 22 BBY, providing instant impact in the ongoing Clone Wars, notably at the battles of Malastare, Camino, and Sullust. ARC-170s flown by Clone Flight 7 would famously protect Jedi's Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi during the Battle of Coruscant, as well as playing a more sinister role in the ruthless killing of General Plo Koon during the Order 66 crisis of 19 BBY. The type would continue to serve in the Imperial Navy, and some would even find their way into the hands of the Rebel Alliance in later years, but that's maybe a story for another time. In the new political and military climate following Order 66 and the formation of the Galactic Empire, Incom soon joined the competition for the new frontline Navy fighter, using experience gained from both the Z-95 and the ARC-170, and the rapid technological advances prompted by 3 years of war. Development began on a new project attempting to combine the strengths of both starfighters, the small, durable, and highly adaptable frame of the Z-95, with the increased firepower, hyperdrive, and astromech capability and the S-foil layout of the ARC-170. Despite being designed for and funded by the Imperial Navy and intended for widespread frontline use, the Navy soon went cold on the program, opting to field TIE fighters instead. The TIE, built by Cinar Fleet Systems, was inferior to Incom's design, but the revised Imperial fighter doctrine called for a high number of cheap, easily maintained fighters that could be deployed across the growing empire, especially as insurgency brewed. Incom continued working on the project though, which would then be known officially as the T-65. Their motivation was still very much financial, but they had a new potential buyer. the still completely unproven Rebel Alliance, led by ex-Imperial Senator Mon Mothma, as they would later discover. A starfighter like the T-65 would be very useful for the new group, especially as the T-65, equipped with a hyperdrive and an astromech slot from factory, could operate alone or in small groups. This complemented their doctrine of small, dispersed attack groups scattered throughout the galaxy, essentially the opposite of the Imperial Navy's deployment plans. The base T-65 used the adapted, lengthened hull of the more advanced Z-95 variants, with more space behind the pilot to allow installation of the Novaldex 04Z power generator, advanced sensor suite, and astromech droid. The pilot sat in the cockpit up front, under the trans-parasteel canopy. Many controls were reused from Incom's successful T-16 Skyhopper airspeeder, allowing the new starfighter to be controlled with relative ease, even by inexperienced pilots who wouldn't know an S-foil from a nose cone. The T-65 was propelled by 4 of Incom's proprietary 4L4 fusible thrust engines, capable of speeding the new fighter along at 100 megalights per hour, the same speed as the much more expensive ARC-170. Each 4L4 engine had an attached GBK 585 hyperdrive motivator for the Class 1 hyperdrive on board. The T-65 kept the wing shape and form of the Z-95 but had 4 wings instead of 2, and utilised the S-foil technology of the ARC-170. Spreading these so-called X-foils allowed greater effectiveness of deflector shields, enhanced cooling of the root-mounted engines, and gave a greater field of fire for the 4 KX-9 laser cannons, one being mounted on the tip of each wing. Like the ARC-170, the T-65 would also be armed with twin, fuselage-mounted Krupp-X MG7 proton torpedo launchers under the pilot, each with a magazine of 3 torpedoes at full load. In summary, Incom's T-65 was a fast, highly maneuverable and highly capable multi-role starfighter, but was complex, maintenance-heavy and expensive compared to contemporary designs like Sinar's TIE in-space superiority fighters. As Imperial interest in the T-65 project faded, suspicion of Incom's involvement with the Rebel Alliance grew. The revolutionary leader, Saul Guerrera, stole 8 of the new starfighter in a raid of Incom's warehouse on Frezia, using them against Imperial forces as early as 5 BBY with notable success. Following continued harassment and interrogation of Incom personnel by the ISB, Rebel commandos raided Incom, stealing plans, data, parts and prototypes of the T-65, along with Incom's engineering personnel. Soon the majority of those employed at Incom had defected to the rebellion, allowing the rebels to not only operate the T-65 as their frontline starfighter, but also work on improving the design. By this point, the base model T-65 was no longer in production, with only a few prototypes made. The early production units were instead designated T-65A, with a limited number of these produced before work switched to a faster, more refined version with further improvements, the T-65B. T-65B was the mainstay of the Rebel Navy during the Galactic Civil War. Between 5 and 1 BBY, T-65B equipped X-Wing squadrons regularly skirmished with Imperial TIE fighters, but over Scariff in 1 BBY, the T-65B, along with some early variants of the T-65C, would get its first taste of large-scale space combat, as T-65's a Blue Squadron, led by General Antok Merrick, slipped through the shield gate to provide close air support for rebel troops on the surface of Scariff, while Garvin Drace's Red Squadron suppressed defense turrets, and Zap Koop's Green Squadron engaged with the swarming TIE fighter threat. T-65s took massive losses during the battle, especially Blue Squadron, with many of the new starfighters lost during the dash through the shield gate, and yet more lost on the surface of Scariff, including General Merrick himself, who was shot down and killed by an experimental TIE Striker. However, despite these losses, the performance of the T-65 was exemplary, and was instrumental in the Alliance's first major victory of the Galactic Civil War. In the lead up to the Battle of Yavin, Rebel and Incom engineers adapted the T-65B into many different roles, creating yet more variants of the starfighter. A recon variant of the T-65B was created, known as the T-65BR, or the Recon X. This sacrificed the offensive power of the proton torpedo launchers, replacing them with a nose-mounted Snoop Scoot, containing advanced avionics and sensor systems, and operating with an experimental R2R astromech to provide intel to the fleet through hyperspace. The equipment was so sensitive that the R2 unit, the craft itself, and the pilot all had self-destruct mechanisms. Incremental changes and improvements to the T-65's design were usually added on to the end of the designation. For example, some T-65As were given retroactive improvements to bring them closer to T-65B standard, creating the T-65 A1, A2, and A3. Later models like the T-65B and newest T-65C will be similarly labelled when fitted with modifications. At Scariff, there were numerous T-65C A2s, flown mostly by the elite members of Red Squadron like fighter ace and renowned bad boy Jack Piggy Porkins, Red 6. Incom also developed two-seat tandem variants of the T-65. The TX-65, also known as the Tandem X, was used mostly for training purposes, but some were adapted for combat use, operating onboard sensors and targeting systems. The T-65 series was instrumental during the Battle of Yavin. Rebel generals understood that a large-scale assault on the Empire's recently completed DS-1 orbital battle station would be suicidal, so based their attack plan around using the X-Wings along with BTL-A4 Y-Wings to swarm the DS-1. The rebels approached the so-called Death Star with a force of only 30 fighters and bombers, 12 T-65Bs and Cs of Red Squadron, 10 T-65Bs of Green Squadron, and 8 Gold Squadron Y-Wings. Initially, the force succeeded in getting close to the battle station and weaving through the defensive positions, but after losing Jack Porkins, the tide turned. The arrival of the elite TIE fighter squadrons, including Black Squadron led by Darth Vader in his TIE Advanced, saw many of the rebel starfighters destroyed, unable to use the strengths of the X-Wing in the confines of the trench. But the rebels knew, through the work of Galen Erso and Rogue One, that if just one of their pilots could fire a proton torpedo into the thermal exhaust port, the entire station would be destroyed. Gold leader John Vander, along with Gold 2 and 5, were first to attempt a run at the exhaust port, but could not make the shot in the slower Y-Wing bombers, and were destroyed by Black Squadron fighters. Red leader Garvin Dryce made a similar attempt along with Red 10 and 12, getting close enough to fire the torpedoes, but missing what was proving to be an almost impossible shot before they too were destroyed. The final attempt on the exhaust port was led by Luke Skywalker in Red 5, escorted by wingmen Wedge Antilles and Biggs Darklighter in Red 2 and Red 3. Red 2 was forced to disengage, while Darklighter's X-Wing was destroyed protecting the young Jedi from Black Leader as Skywalker lined up his shot. We've all read the history books, so I'm sure I don't need to tell you what happened next. Commander Skywalker was able to dodge the TIE long enough to get close to the exhaust port and launch his proton torpedoes, destroying the battle station. Only 2 T-65s, Skywalker and Antilles, of the initial 22 survived the battle, along with 1 Y-Wing, Gold 3. The X-Wing's combat history is far too long to fit into this video. They were present at every major battle of the Galactic Civil War, including Hoth in 3 ABY, the decisive Battle of Endor a year later, and the last stand of the Empire at Jakku in 5 ABY. By the Battle of Jakku, the T-65 was no longer flying for the Rebel Alliance, but for the New Republic, and would continue to serve for years to come. But by 5 ABY, the New Republic were already testing the next generation of X-Wing, the T-70. The T-70 was a culmination of a number of experimental variants of the T-65, namely the T-65 XJ, XJ3, and XJ5, and gave the New Republic a massively improved, albeit more expensive, frontline fighter. The T-70 retained much of the T-65's fuselage, but has distinctive split intakes for the more powerful 5L5 engines, a technology first tested on the T-65 XJ3. This allowed the smaller, faster T-70 to be even more manoeuvrable than its predecessor, with a top speed of 110 mglt in open space and retro thrusters facing forward to rapidly decelerate if required. The T-70's onboard systems were improved across the board from the T-65, including the laser cannons, hyperdrive motivators, sensor and targeting systems, armor and deflector shields, and proton torpedo loadout. However, the T-70 did not have a large-scale war to fight, and the disastrous Military Disarmament Act, put through in 4 ABY, limited the production run of the T-70, with widespread corruption in the New Republic ensuring that T-70 factories were poorly run and inefficient. The majority of T-70s ended up going to planetary defense units, serving for almost 20 years before the arrival of the T-85 in 24 ABY. The T-85 was a similarly significant upgrade, seeing, yet again, upgrades to all major sensor, targeting, hyperdrive and weapon systems, and taking the X-Wing design as far as it could ever realistically go, topping out at a blistering 120 mglt, as fast as Kuat's revolutionary RZ-1 A-Wing. T-85s were deployed in anti-piracy roles when the emergence of the First Order became clear, and fought First Order TIE fighters before the majority of the T-85 fleet was erased when the Hosnian system was destroyed in 34 ABY. This left the aging T-70s, which were quickly put into frontline service in the Resistance Navy and served excellently, even against the newest TIE fighters, seeing notable success in the Battle of Takodana, the Battle of Starkiller Base, and the Battle of Dakar. Perhaps the most famous T-70 during the conflict was Black 1, the modified starfighter of General Poe Dameron, leader of Black Squadron, who led the air team during the Battle of Exegol in 35 ABY. Who knows where Incom Frytech will take the design moving forward if they decide to continue development at all. Many sources suggest that T-85 production will resume in the next few years, but considering the massive price tag of the T-85 program, that's yet to be seen. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, folks. I wanted to better educate everyone on the X-Wing's lineage. If you did enjoy, please do consider subscribing for more content that's sort of like this, and or supporting me on Patreon to get all my videos early and ad-free. If not, I'll see you next year, and may the Force be with you if you believe in that sort of thing.